They're a bit unscripted and more of conversation than intense scrutiny to the panelists. We've got about 25, 30 minutes. We have some time to dive deep. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves first, starting with...
Veronica Mcgregor, Chief Legal Officer, Shapeshift.
Alexia Hefti, Blockchain Tax Lead at Deloitte, focusing on regulation and tax.
Jacob Farber, Principal at Ouroboros.
Let's talk a bit more about what you guys are doing. What are you doing at Shapeshift, for example?
Right now, let's see, we are developing our platform, about to introduce more robust stuff, and have re-domiciled ourselves from Switzerland to UK.
So on my end...
It's interesting to know, what does it look like a day in the life of a blockchain lawyer, and what are you doing overall?
So I guess for me, it changes a lot. The crypto winter has obviously resulted in a big change in work away from structuring ICOs internationally in crypto-friendly jurisdictions, and now actually doing some work at looking at how governments can integrate blockchain technology within their different agencies, such as tax authorities globally. Fun. Looking at integrating DLT into their platforms.
And Jacob?
This has been the year that people sort of got back to work after the token sale boom went bust and people had to do something other than mint money for a while in blockchain. So she's exactly right. It feels like people are sort of refocusing on going back to figuring out some of the basic legal and regulatory problems that sort of got put aside while everybody chased money for a while. And I know we joke about crypto winter, but I actually think it's a good thing because it's really, how many times have we said that everybody's refocusing and wheat from the chaff? But in addition to all that and the good projects rising to the top, it really is now that people are really focusing, governments are getting involved in really thinking about regulation, and there's money being spent from the private sector on us lawyers to work through the legal problems. And after what feels like 4 or 5 years of the status of crypto and blockchain law being the same, which was nothing, it was all a huge unknown, it feels like slowly we're beginning kind of a little bit to get some clarity.
Before we talk about the trends and what's going on in crypto and regulation, let's spend a minute to touch on your point of everybody chasing money. And how big are the speeding tickets going to be for certain companies?
Oh, I'm not touching that one, my friend.
A bunch of them probably got pinged.
Yeah.
And how big and intense and the blowback or the hangover, how intense will the hangover be after what has happened?
So we should give a little context for that. There were, literally, as you guys know, thousands of token sales, and there have been a relative handful of reported SEC actions against token sales here and some state actions here, and then the U.S. is not the only country on the planet. We have other people in the panel who can talk about that. But there have been investigations, but they've gone after the obvious scams. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, a lot of projects and some advisors and people in blockchain have gotten subpoenas, and the SEC has been conducting sort of a low-level investigation is probably not a fair characterization, but it doesn't feel like they're going to bring the hammer down on a huge number of projects where it hasn't hit yet. I think they're going to do what they've done to date, which is go after the really low-hanging fruit of the easy targets, scammy bad actors, and as long as people have done a relatively decent job of attempting compliance, I don't think it's time to panic and consider moving out of the country.
I'm not sure moving out of the country is going to fix it anyway, really.
There's some countries without extradition.
Okay. I'm just talking about, like, the UK rules on tokens are largely parallel to the U.S., and there's some other countries that have similar approaches.
Alexa, what does that look like for the rest of the world where...
The rest of the world.
So I'll speak for the
rest
entire
of the
world
world.
here.
As the
in
ambassador
saying,
of the globe.
Right.
I'm actually not based in the United States, for anyone who doesn't know me. I'm based in Canada and do a lot of work in emerging markets as well as just generally internationally. And so, we're seeing extreme angles across the world too. Malaysia just published, essentially put in their regulation that if you are operating an unlicensed either ICO, so it hasn't been registered, or crypto exchange, there is a 10-year prison sentence and $2.4 million fine. That's US dollars. So, we don't actually know if they're going to go to that extreme, and this is just coming out now. But it is very interesting to see some countries go extremely hard after this entire space. And we'll see after, with time, we'll see if they actually go after these individual companies. But so far, especially on the Canadian side, the US side, probably in Europe as well, they will, as you mentioned, go after low-hanging fruit, the obvious scams. And that's what we saw in Canada as well. They went after a clear scam in Quebec, and that's the first company that they targeted.
Do you guys think that what has happened with these ICOs, let's say going after these low-hanging fruits, obvious scams where people were just very, very blatant about not doing the right thing, will that set any precedent as it relates to security tokens and security token offerings, that now they'll use those cases that were scams and sort of tweeze out a few parts of it that look like that for security tokens and then stop those as well in broad regulation based on the ICO regulations?
It's going to be, traditionally how this stuff works is that the regulatory agencies will go after the low-hanging fruit, the obvious scams, and then they will, after those are out of the way, they will then go for things that are less egregious, but still a violation or something they can argue. Like if you make an advertisement, it's not a scam, but you are saying something is going to offer you a piece of the company or an upside of the equity or a financial return on your investment, then that would be probably
But that seems categorically different than ICOs, where it wasn't so close to financial instruments, at least in what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
In some cases.
That's the thing. If you go back to the first token sales, Mastercoin, Ethereum, and then the first wave in 2017, it was what we all now call utility tokens. But the whole idea was you had a blockchain network that had a token that the people who were using the network needed to use. So the idea was the more people who used the network, the more demand there was going to be for the token, and everybody was mutually incentivized to use the token, and it was inherent in the use of the network. It's not clear you're going to get that same effect out of security tokens. People use that phrase, security token, STO, without being careful to say what we mean. If you just mean the same thing that we had before, a utility token, except you're selling it as a security to avoid, to comply with regulation, fine, that may actually be tough to do. What you probably mean these days is something completely different. You're selling a token that represents the digitalization of some asset, or it's literally the equity in a company sold in digital form, or some revenue share, right? It's literally a security instrument, looks like traditional equity. And that's an entirely different thing than the tokens that were being sold in token sales. And whether the token sale boom we had in 27 repeats itself once security tokens are ready, and what we're all kind of waiting for. There are great projects here at this conference. There's T0, there's Polymath, there's others, all creating the infrastructure. We're waiting to be able to trade them and have the infrastructure in place. Once that happens, we're going to have to see if the demand is there, if the same token craziness happens again.
This isn't a regulatory legal question, but I guess, are you seeing this or elements of this that it will happen again with security tokens? Because it seems to me the liquidity pool for security tokens and the amount of people that would invest in security tokens is a lot less than what happened in late 2018.
Well, I keep talking. I'm going to duck this one.
All right.
So from my perspective, I see a big change in the types of clients that come to speak about formerly ICOs, and now they're coming to speak about STOs. And interestingly enough, on the ICO side, it was primarily, if not, primarily 99% were startups. And some of them became very big companies, but they were startups. While on the STO side, the clients that are coming to speak to me about their STOs are not only startups. I'm actually finding a lot of our institutional clients that have, ideas for STOs that revolve around traditional businesses. And so when we talk about what kind of money is going to be around it, well, it's also a different pool, right? It's not someone wanting to go into the ICO craze, make a lot of money and duck out. It's institutional money that's been around for a long time. And a lot of their investors, are seasoned investors. They're different types of investors. So if that money enters as well as, of course, all the people who feel like they missed out, including institutional money on the ICO craze, you may see a lot more or different money come into play.
I think you're right, and it does seem like there's more adults in the room when it comes to the STO conversation. Another big discussion around ICOs over the last year was jurisdictions. Now, if STOs are to take off at 50% of the speed as ICOs, is jurisdiction a question that people should be asking themselves if they're trying to make an STO? Should they be going to some other place around the world?
Typically, such things are not driven so much by where you are domiciled or anything. They're driven by who you're selling to. So you can move yourself to anywhere, and you can talk about extradition or whatever, but that is getting pretty far down the road.
You could have a checkbox on your website that says, "Are you American?" And you go, "No." And then you can sell whatever you want.
So we're lawyers, so we're probably not going to answer saying that's the thing to do.
But I understand. With securities, it's much more serious to who you're selling to.
Yeah, but these are consumer protection laws. They follow the consumer. So who are we trying to protect? We're trying to protect the SEC anyway, not we, but or whatever agency it is, trying to protect those who would be buyers of these security tokens.
Yep.
And so the laws apply. The laws that apply are those in the jurisdiction where the buyers are.
Explain to me, if a company is registered in Japan selling a security token to an American, what are the implications for the company then? Are there any implications to sell to Americans a security based out of Japan?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. would, any agency that's trying to protect its, its consumers, its residents, its citizens is going to try to exercise jurisdiction over anyone who's offering them goods or services or securities.
That's really a great point, and it bears underlining it and highlighting it. When people come and talk to us and other lawyers about what jurisdiction to start a blockchain or a crypto company in, the worst reason to operate in a jurisdiction other than the U.S. is because you think you're going to avoid U.S. law. If you're doing business with the citizens of a country, it's certainly true in the U.S., and it's true of most other countries. Theoretically, you're subject to that country's laws, and you have to comply with those countries' laws as long as you're interacting with their citizens. So if you have customers in the U.S., you're subject to U.S. law, period, no debate about it. And that gets lost in the whole jurisdictional selection question. Better reasons to pick a jurisdiction, taxation. What are the local rules regarding blockchain and token sales? Are there developers around? What are the employment laws like? But people get hung up on trying to avoid regulation when they pick a jurisdiction, and you got to kind of twist your thinking there and think more about, well, is the jurisdiction you're going to a good, hospitable environment? Not that you're necessarily escaping the reach of any other jurisdiction, so long as you're going to do business with people in that jurisdiction.
And that's not just true of securities regulation. It's it's true of banking and money transmitter laws and all that stuff. Because anytime, anytime you're reaching out to someone else's citizens, that country is going to try to impose their own laws on you. I mean, that's how they protect their citizens. So makes sense, but not just for securities.
Yeah, and I think, when you're setting up a business, what it really comes down to is the environment good for running your business. So in the blockchain sense, it's just about, is there good blockchain regulation and tax regulation? A lot of people will look at a jurisdiction and say, oh, this is great because it has a low tax. Surely it does. But as soon as you're using a developer in Latvia or in Russia, well, there may be withholding tax that applies. So that's 15%, it could be more, it could be 20% withholding tax because you made a payment out to another jurisdiction. And so there, you may ask yourself, where a lot of payments are being made externally, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I selected the jurisdiction for tax purposes alone. Again, doesn't make any sense. Interestingly enough, on the securities debate, and I'm not a securities lawyer, one thing that's interesting is in the United States, we have really taken this stance that tokens are primarily securities, while a lot of jurisdictions have not. So while of course you need to consider the fact that if you have American investors, you are subject to securities regulations in the US. If you avoid the US investors, which many people do, as well as investors from other jurisdictions which have more conservative rules, then you are subject to the local jurisdiction. And I think that's really important. When you're looking at, globally, and you're looking at governments, of course, in the Caribbean, Bermuda, for example, Barbados as another example, that are really taking steps on every aspect of the business. Not only creating the right regulation, the good and favorable tax environments, but also, like you said, creating an ecosystem. You have access to developers. You have work permits that can go through in 2 weeks, rather than 2-3 months, which makes it really hard to operate a business. So I think, people really need to look at the whole aspect of running a business. A lot of the time when people are selecting jurisdictions, they say, oh, I'll go do it in Cayman. But they're not willing to actually run a business in Cayman. They just like to pop a company there. You can't really do that today. There are substance rules. And so I think it's really important for people to consider kind of the holistic aspect of running a business.
There's another aspect too, which when you're choosing a jurisdiction, and that is sort of reputation. If you want to form a company in a country that's low on regulation, what's going to happen is when you start to reach out to other countries and investors or users there, those regulators might look at you, and question you more because you're from a jurisdiction known for money laundering or known for, in general, fringiness. So you should consider
Interestingly
that.
enough, though, I think a lot of the jurisdictions that previously had been known that way, I know the Caribbean has had, for example, kind of a black paintbrush painted across it as being, a region that does that. In fact, what we've seen come out of that region, as well as what we're seeing across emerging markets in general, is that they're actually bringing in very clear regulation. Bermuda just published their new practice code on their how to actually store digital assets. So from a custodial perspective, I think that's really, they've been very proactive in constantly providing regulation, and that goes for many other countries where we wouldn't have necessarily expected that kind of clarity. And so I think you're definitely right. Where there's no regulation, that's probably not a jurisdiction in which you'd want to structure. But in fact, a lot of countries are actually taking steps to create a very clear regulatory framework where you can actually operate and be, a bit more safe.
That Bermuda's a good example of a jurisdiction, and there's more of them that are actively courting this industry because, they think they can work. They're small enough. they can.
Yeah, you also see countries like those where the stock exchange or the local stock exchange will openly try to promote businesses starting up and working with the exchanges and having securities on the exchange. Jacob, any comments on this, or are you still skipping out on this?
No, I'm not skipping out. There's a healthy competition right now among a lot of the smaller jurisdictions trying to attract businesses in this space, and everybody's trying to create these really fertile grounds for blockchain companies, and they're doing it by rolling out very clear regulation, because we've all started saying, well, I'd take regulation over nothing just for clarity. But remember, great, you have a clear regulatory landscape, terrific. But, okay, now give me other
Most
good
of those
reasons.
places, governments aren't shut down.
Right. It's a huge plus. So, yeah, don't get me started.
I don't know.
But honestly, in the end, we're not going to have the same 15 or 20 crypto jurisdictions du jour in 5 years that we've run through in the last 5. I mean, you can tick off, Isle of Man, Bermuda, Cayman, BVI, Liechtenstein, Switzerland. That's going to, winnow itself down. There'll be a handful that really emerge, Singapore, Hong Kong. And I imagine that a couple will emerge as the blockchain financial capitals, who knows which. But really, it's a little bit like the internet if you think about it. We keep talking about blockchain regulation. It's kind of irrelevant. There's not internet regulation, for example. I mean, you get regulated as a blockchain business depending on what it is you do. If you're doing stuff that touches the securities laws, you're regulated under securities laws. So all this talk about rolling out blockchain regulation is a little bit overplayed, and without knowing what everybody in the audience is doing, it's hard to talk about what jurisdiction is appealing, because when you really dig into it, the fact that you have, quote, a blockchain regulatory regime is kind of meaningless, I mean, the question is, okay, are you doing a token sale? Are you doing a security token sale? So, okay, great. What are the regimes that have supposedly made the world safe for token sales? That's relevant. The other big regime that we've sort of stopped talking about because we've all gotten so obsessed over ICOs and securities is money transmission and money laundering. And for the first 3 or 4 years of blockchain and crypto companies, those were the legal regimes that literally stalled progress and development, innovation, and got people thrown in jail, and then sort of, security, happened. I think we're gonna, we'll solve the security token thing, and we're gonna go back to worrying about money transmission and moving value around, and how heavily that's regulated. And that's
the
going
US
to be
regulated
I think,
state by state.
Yeah,
So.
and I think those are going to be the more relevant regulatory regimes for a lot of the companies in this room in the next couple of years.
So interestingly enough, I agree to the extent that we don't necessarily need to be putting in blockchain regulation, because like you said, we can use traditional regulation. And we've seen Switzerland do this. They've moved towards saying, look, we have regulation. We're going to tweak our regulation for this business. But I think from a tax perspective, it's very interesting because it really does matter. And what we see is tax authorities across the world, including in Canada, for example, vacillating on how they're going to treat certain aspects. And they really need to give us clarity from a characterization point of view on how they're going to treat things. Crypto mining is a good example. Canada has a lot of crypto miners, thanks to our cheap energy. And a lot of crypto miners are very confused about how to treat crypto mining from a tax perspective, because our tax authorities have not told us whether we should, tax the coin when it's mined or tax it when it's sold. Well, in the United States, there's a little more clarity on that side. So that's very important, because it's become, for many provinces, a very important part of the economy, yet not necessarily a very important part of the economy, but a new aspect of our economy. And yet there's no clarity. In other jurisdictions, you don't know if it's treated as a commodity or a currency, or a foreign currency for that matter, which could very well matter when it comes to withholding tax and any kind of international aspects of your business. So I think that's where it's less about creating new regulation, but actually characterizing some of, particularly in the cryptocurrency context, something that we know is going to continue to exist.
Something I've been saying for a long time, but that's because I started my career as a payments lawyer and money transmission and all that stuff, is that just like the internet, it's all in the application of what you're doing, what the regulation is going to apply.
But things get a little hairy, as we've seen over the last 3 months, where there's a stable coin popping up daily, which is sometimes autonomous and sometimes makes its own rules. And considering law isn't machine readable, especially by these stable coins that exist and operate autonomously, I have nowhere where to start talking about the law and some of these stable coins.
I'll go wading in. It's a mess. We represent several stable coins, and the range of regulatory compliance goes from, there's regulations that might apply to me, to attempts to comply on a 50-state basis. It's $1 million worth of compliance. And one of the reasons why there's this incredible range is there are debates among people who spend a lot of time thinking about this, about what regimes apply. And that's a problem because there is so little guidance in the space. And the regulators aren't offering it. It's hard to get it. And if you go and ask for it, you get stuck with the answer you get. And so nobody wants to do that. So it's stayed very fuzzy. And you sort of, then it comes down to, you have to make an assessment of how much risk you want to take on. Do you want to depend on the fact that it's sort of a murky environment to proceed, taking on some risk, Hopefully you've been well counseled and you know how likely it is you may or may not go to jail, but you're gonna have an aggressive policy. Or are you gonna cross, every T, dot every I, spend a fortune, slow down? And right now there is just no good roadmap through that, and we are seeing, smart projects helmed by, thoughtful people making elections across that spectrum. And it's really interesting, and what explains that is how little clarity there is in the regulatory environment on that particular point. And for reasons I could go into, but there's already 2 people sleeping in the audience, and it will take out at least another 3 if I do it.
Any comments on stablecoins?
I have no comments on stablecoins.
It's such a strange thing, stablecoins, isn't it? It's like counterfeiting money, but not.
This is why we have no comments on stablecoins.
I mean, one thing that occurs to me is we were just talking about this earlier. I think it's very much a short-term phenomenon because eventually we're going to see some, sovereign governments issue on-ledger currency, and that's the end of stablecoins, right?
I think we're already seeing that because the Barbados government has agreed to start a pilot project with a bit.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of interesting initiatives, and these projects have been threatening to come about for a long time. Like 3 years ago, the Bank of England was on the verge of doing a large-scale trial that sort of sputtered out. But, I mean, it will happen eventually. That's a great example of a currently active program. But I think once that happens, you don't need stable coins anymore.
You heard it here first. Take a leverage short on Tether.
Well, you don't have to be a genius to take that position.
We got 2 minutes left. If you've got a final thought, please share it. Otherwise, we'll get off stage. But let's share a final thought on the regulatory environment. Optimistic one.
An optimistic one?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, with that caveat, look, it's what we've all been saying. The regulation in this area is fluid. It has to be because law is very slow and technology is very fast. And by the time the law catches up to whatever technology is doing, it no longer makes sense if it ever made sense to begin with. And so you just kind of have to keep your eyes open and make smart decisions and don't base them on we're going to domicile in this region because it seems like they're very crypto friendly when a month later they could roll out some incredibly onerous regulation and then you're stuck. So I
wasn't optimistic.
Oh, wait, and puppies.
There we go.
There's optimistic? Okay.
So I'm going to be a little optimistic here. I've seen some fantastic work come out of civil society organizations, blockchain organizations that are coming together across regions. You have, I'm involved in the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance and one operating out of Africa as well, which are actually really helping regulators. They're made up of, you've got a bunch of people in these groups, from regulators themselves to tax lawyers, securities lawyers, developers, techies, absolutely everybody. And I think it's been really fantastic because some governments have actually gone into what are WhatsApp groups and taken guidance from civil society in how to move things forwards. And I really hope that 2019 will be a lot more about that, regulators listening to the people who are actually building these things out, And I think perhaps they'll have a little bit more time because they won't be chasing at the speed as they were in 2017, 2018.
Shucks, we're out of time. Neither optimistic nor positive. Something to think about is I think we're going to see over the next year or two, the interesting question that's going to get figured out is just how much of a defense decentralization is going to be against government and regulators. I think that's going to be the big thing that gets settled out, because to escape regulation, lots of projects are structured to be decentralized, and I don't think that in the end, if people are doing bad things, that any amount of decentralization is going to keep the governments that really want to get people from finding ways to get at them.
And optimism?
No, but that's not neither. That's sort of a technical, interesting, if you like, legal shit point. That's not optimistic or pessimistic. You want optimism? I think in the long run that none of the legal actions or the regulatory weight has really stopped anything. I think it slowed it down, but I think that's beginning to fall away, and I think you'll see that to the extent that development of blockchain has been impeded by regulation, which I absolutely think it has. It's been a 4-year drag. I think that is falling away, and I think there'll be an acceleration as a result. Boom.
Wait. True.
Oh, no.
No, come on. All right. I was going to say also, lots of jurisdictions are looking to learn more about the technology. As they learn more, they can make more reasonable regulations. So that's optimistic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.